In her book, Second Calling, Dale Bork writes that years ago she attended a conference, and when it was over, her friend Bruce offered her a ride to the airport. As they were about to leave, another man asked if he could join them. And as they drove away from the hotel, she and Bruce asked the man where he worked. He mentioned a Christian organization, and Bruce said, "I have fond memories of that group because I attended a retreat of theirs one time, and that's where I became a Christian. It was in 1972 in New Hampshire." Bruce went on to explain that eventually his whole family became Christians. Bruce went on to explain that eventually his whole family became Christians because of the Christian work. His sister was a Wycliffe missionary. Bruce himself became a publisher of a major Christian publishing house that sent God's printed word and books that supported that around the world. Brought Christian publishing house that sent God's printed word and books that supported that around the world. Brought, when you think about it. The man was silent. Dale and Bruce thought maybe they were boring him. And then the stranger quietly said, "I led that retreat. It was my first time as a conference leader, and I felt it was a total failure. Until this moment, I've always believed it was one of the biggest failures of my life." Dale Bork wrote about that. What had seemed like the simple act of offering a ride to a stranger had turned into a powerful reminder that God uses our efforts whether we realize it or not. I may spend the rest of my life doing things that don't seem all successful, and yet only God knows the purpose. I am called simply to be faithful. I can't tell you if your efforts are going to be seen or unseen while we're here below in this world, but I know this. It is amazing what God can do through us when we're willing to be used of Him. So we see in our text today what God did through Jonathan and through his armor bearer as we continue taking our messages from 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 1 through 23, we're going to use that portion for our text, and there we find these words. Now the day came that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come and let us cross over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side." But he did not tell his father Saul, who was staying. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah under the pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. And the people who were with him were about 600 men. And Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the priest of the Lord at Shiloh, was wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Between the passes by which Jonathan sought to cross over to the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp crag on the one side and a sharp crag on the other side. And the name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Seneh. The one crag rose on the north opposite of Mishmash, and the other on the south opposite Geba. Then Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come and let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us. For the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few." His armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Turn yourself, and here I am with you according to your desire." Then Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men and reveal ourselves to them. If they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand in our place and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hands, and this shall be the sign to us. When both of them revealed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines said, behold, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they've hidden themselves. So the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan his armor bearer and said, come up to us, and we will tell you something. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hands of Israel. Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet with his armor bearer behind him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer put some to death after him. And that first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within about half a furlong in an acre of land. And there was a trembling in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. Even the garrison and the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked, so that it became a great trembling. Now Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away, and they went here and there. Saul said to the people who were with him, number now and see who has gone from us. And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. Then Saul said to Abijah, bring the ark of God here, for the ark of God was at that time with the sons of Israel. And while Saul talked to the priests, the commotion in the camp of the Philistines continued and increased. So Saul said to the priests, withdraw your hand. And then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle. And behold, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was a very great confusion. Now the Hebrews who were with the Philistines previously, who went up with them all around in the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines had fled, even they also pursued them closely in the battle. So the Lord delivered Israel that day, and the battle spread beyond Beth-aven. Why don't you see in our text, first of all, this morning, a man of faith. Jonathan believed that God was greater than the mighty army that was assembled against them. Do you remember that army as we're talking about it? About the 30,000 chariots and the soldiers that were like the sand of the beach there. That was a huge army. Maybe the largest army assembled in ancient times. But Jonathan believed that his God was greater than all this military might which was on display that day. And this is the basis for what he did that day. Others saw the overwhelming might of the Philistine army, and they counted the battle as already lost, but not Jonathan. Since it was by God's power and not by man's, Jonathan believed God could work even through one man. He said, whether it's many or few, if that man was trusting God, Jonathan believed God could work through him to cause a great effect. He believed God could act, but he did not want to presume on God's will. Simply because he believed that God could give the victory that day, he didn't believe it was right for him to pursue that victory unless he got communication from God that that was God's intention. And so he devised a way for God's will to be made known to them. He and his armor bearer were going to go up close to the Philistine camp. They're going to just be separated by that last cliff. And they were going to, when they were spotted, they were going to listen to how the Philistines greeted them. When the enemy saw them, they would discern what God willed for them to do by how the enemy greeted them. Our passage says, if they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand in our place and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hands, and this shall be the sign on us. Jonathan wanted to know that it was God's will for him to act that day. And so he listened to the words that would be a sign that God wanted him to act in that way. I want to point out to you this morning that Jonathan's faith was not just an intellectual conviction. He was willing to act even though there were obstacles in the way. Our passage points out to us that there were two crags, two cliffs, two sheer rock faces that had to be crossed for Jonathan and his armor bearer to go to where the Philistines were at. They had to climb up two cliffs to get there. But even though there were those obstacles, they didn't let that deter them. They got to where the work was to be done. And what's more, we can see this isn't an intellectual faith only on the part of Jonathan, because he was willing to bet his life on it. He was going to a place where he knew he would be greatly outnumbered. This was a garrison of the Philistines who had this mighty force around him, and he was one man accompanied with his servant. One man accompanied with his armor bearer was going to take on this mighty Philistine force. And in this, what Jonathan did that day, it shows us what it is to live by faith. If we are going to live by faith, it must mean we believe, first of all, that our God is able. That we understand that no matter what things are towering around us, that our God is bigger than that. We must believe that he can work through us, whether we be many or few. Even if no one else will stand with us, we must believe that God can work his power through us if we act on faith. And we must seek his will to be done through us, consulting him before we act. We aren't supposed to get a good idea in our heads and just go ahead and run with it, thinking God's going to come along with us. We should consult the Lord and be ready to do what he wills and not what we will in the challenge which is before us. And if we're people of faith, then we must do what God would have us to do, even though there are obstacles in the way. You know, when we undertake something for the Lord, it's very seldom without interference. It's very seldom that we just simply go and do what we believe God's calling us to do. There's usually obstacles which are in the way. It might not be a couple of sheer cliff faces that are before us, but there are going to be some things which will discourage people from doing what the Lord has called them to do. We can't become discouraged if we're doing the Lord's work. We must put all on the line for him. We must trust him, not by dipping our toe tentatively in the water. We plunge in. We give to his work and his will all that we have and all that we are. That's what it means to live by faith. Secondly, I want you to see in this passage a loyal servant. Jonathan's armor bearer hadn't seen the opportunity to act like his master did. This wasn't his vision, born of his conviction. And yet when the way was pointed out, he risked every bit as much in his faith. When Jonathan told him what he intended to do by God's power, he didn't balk and dig in his heels. He didn't argue that they should do less. He didn't sit back and say, "That sounds good. I wish you well in your efforts." No. His response to Jonathan was, "Do all that is in your heart. Turn yourself, and here I am with you according to your desire." Jonathan's armor bearer says, "Where you go, I'm going to go. I will be at your side in all that you intend to do." He was loyal to his master, and he was loyal to his God. He scaled the same cliffs that Jonathan did, right there beside his master, and him carrying the armor with him. That's a pretty good feat right there as well. And he also participated in winning the victory, not as a mighty warrior. He didn't have the skills for battle that Jonathan did, but he did his part. Following right behind Jonathan there, he dispatched a lot of the enemy himself. So even though Jonathan did a mighty work, he'd followed through doing what he was able to do on the battlefield. He did what he could with the opportunity that he was given. I want to remind you this morning, God didn't make us all for the leadership roles. Some he made to be supporting workers. And God doesn't call us to be anything other than what he made us to be. God doesn't expect us to do what he has not equipped us to do. He doesn't expect us to accomplish what is beyond our means. He reminds us that there's honor in the work of the lowest servant when it's service which is done faithfully. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 2. Now it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. What's a steward? Someone to whom his master entrusts his goods. Someone who holds in trust what belongs to his master. What are we? We're stewards of what God has entrusted to us. And we are not required to do based on what we don't have, but based on what he has given to us. And in whatever circumstance, our job is to act faithfully. In the church, there are places for those who lead, and there are places for those who will loyally serve. And those doing the essential service work often don't get the glory. Did you notice here, all through this passage, this man who carried Jonathan's armor up the cliff faces, this man who went unaccompanied except with Jonathan to face a mighty enemy, this man who did his part in fighting that enemy, we're never told his name. Jonathan's armor bearer. As a servant, we only know what was done, not really who did it. And we see that often in service roles in the church. They don't get the recognition of the people who are up front. They don't get the recognition of the people who are leading. A lot of times people don't even know who is doing the work that they see being done. But they aren't doing it for man's recognition. And God sees. And God knows their name. And thus the support work is high and holy work to be done for God's recognition, even if no one else sees and appreciates what we're doing. Finally, in our text, we come to those who follow. No one else knew what Jonathan and his armor bearer were doing by the power of God. None in the camp of Israel knew anything about what Jonathan was doing in winning this mighty battle, what the armor bearer was doing in faithfully following Jonathan into that battle. Nobody knows that they were absent. It wasn't until they saw the enemy retreating and took account of their own men that they discovered the absence of these two. It was only then that they noticed that Jonathan and his armor bearer were not with them. Up until that time, the 600 men that had assembled with Saul had done nothing about the enemy. They were huddled in their little assembly, hoping that the wrath of the enemy might not come against them. Even worse were all the others who had abandoned the army and were now hiding in their holes. They sought places in clefts and in caves and any place they could find to hide from the enemy. That's what they were doing in this time. They were fleeing the enemy in terror. But when they heard of Jonathan's great victory, when they saw that the enemy was fleeing him, then they knew that victory was at hand. And then they stepped up. They came out of their holes. They pursued the enemy. You know, we saw a lot to commend in Jonathan's actions as a man of faith. We saw a lot to commend in his armor bearer's actions as a man with a servant heart who was willing to do. Unfortunately, on those who followed, this isn't so commendable. Had no one stepped forth in victorious faith, they would have continued to be in retreat before the enemy. It wasn't until they saw that the tide had turned that they were willing to join in. But at least they were willing to join in God's side when that side was prevailing. Unfortunately, that's been the way with God's people through all the ages. We have the few who are doing their best and the greater number who are hardly trying. Church growth experts call it the 80-20 principle. They say 80% of the work done in a congregation is done by 20% of the people. We have a few that are shouldering the burden, but the vast majority of people want to sit back as audience and don't want to participate. Now, I think, that's a lot lower than that 20% in a good number of churches, but I think it's a lot higher here where we've been winnowed down to the faithful few, as it were, that we have people who are taking their place and trying to do what God wants them to do. So we see people who are willing to come and huddle together on a Sunday morning, but fear to confront the enemy outside the church. Even more those who are hiding in holes, as it were, those who say they belong to the church, but they never come, they never attend, they don't bother even assembling together with the faithful, let alone doing the work that God's called them to do. And thankfully, sometimes these can be rallied to stand with the church when others have acted on faith and led the way. Still, I fear that these might be regarded by the Lord in judgment someday as those who buried their talent in the ground and failed to do what their Lord had entrusted them to do with their talents. This morning, that brings us to our invitation time. Are you living your life by faith? Are you willing to give all that you have and all that you are on that conviction? Only as we live with courage by faith can God do the great things through us that he intends to do. Many or few, will you place your trust in him? This morning, if you'd like to follow the Jesus Christ, if you'd like to give your life to him or renew your commitment to him, we have an invitation song. We're going to sing I Will Follow for our invitation song this morning. Let's stand together.